Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for everyone for joining today for the latest lecture of the World War II Discussion Forums Fall Series. I'm Greg McNiff, the founder and executive director of the group. Before I introduce this afternoon's speaker, I want to briefly cover the usual housekeeping items. First, our speaker has graciously agreed to take questions after his prepared remarks. You have two ways to ask your question. You can either use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and I will read out your question to our speaker, or if you prefer to ask your question directly, please use the raised hand feature at the bottom of your screen, and I will call on you to unmute your line. Regardless of the method, please be respectful of our speaker and the audience when asking your question. We'll take about 20 or so minutes of questions and end promptly around 2 p.m. New York time. Second, donations are always appreciated. There is a donate tab on the website. Third, we have a YouTube channel, and today's talk is being recorded and will be posted to the YouTube channel shortly afterwards. There is an icon to access the channel at the top of the website. And fourth and finally, you can send any feedback to the website at wwiidf.org. Now to this afternoon's speaker, someone I'm thrilled to have. Garrett Graff has spent over 2 decades covering politics, technology, and national security. He's the former editor of Political Magazine and longtime Wired and CNN contributor. He writes the popular Doomsday Scenario newsletter and hosts the Edward R. Murrow award-winning podcast Long Shadow. He is the author of 10 books, including the #1 national bestseller, The Only Plane in the Sky, The FBI History, The Threat Matrix, Raven Rock, and New York Times bestseller, When the Sea Came Alive, and Watergate, A New History, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in History. This afternoon, Garrett will speak on his 10th book and latest, The Devil Reached Toward the Sky, an oral history of the making and unleashing of the atomic bomb, which offers a panoramic narrative of how ordinary people grapple with extraordinary wartime risks, sacrifices, and choices that will transform the course of history. Not surprising, the reviews have been fantastic. The Wall Street Journal writes, by going deeper into the personal details and reminiscences of a generation that is all but lost to us now, Mr. Graff has made the story more human, especially when the weapon's essential inhumanity threatens to overshadow everything else. Each chapter is a compilation of snippets from interviews, memoirs, and the personal testimony of figures from President Truman and Hiroshima's police chief down to the last survivors of the Hiroshima attack and the man responsible for Fox launches at the plant in Hanford, Washington, that made the plutonium from the bomb used at Nagasaki. Mr. Graff gives us a fascinating account of Robert Oppenheimer, the man who has since become the symbol of the entire bomb project. Overall, this is a fantastic read and truly worthy of anyone's World War II collection. And with that review, I'll turn it over to Garrett.
Great. Well, thank you all for joining on this Saturday afternoon. Greg, I appreciate the invitation. Apologize a little bit for my makeshift Zoom setup today. I'm on book tour still and was speaking this weekend at the Authors Guild Literary Festival in Lenox, Massachusetts. So let me start by talking a little bit about the book project and the topic, and then I'll look forward to taking questions from you all in sort of 30 minutes or so. So this is my third book-length history of oral history. I have done 2 previous books, one that came out in 2019 called The Only Plane in the Sky. The second was a book that came out last year about D-Day, When the Sea Came Alive. And these books are organized entirely in the first person. These are the voices of the people who lived these events firsthand. And what drew me after working on that 9/11 book to the idea of doing a book on World War II in oral history format, of course, the first one, D-Day last year, then the Manhattan Project this year, was we have been marking these 80th anniversaries of the war over the past 5 years. And I think that they feel so poignant to people because the 80th anniversaries in many ways also mark the unofficial final passing of that greatest generation who fought and won World War II. And what that means from a historian's standpoint is that we have every first person history and memory that we will ever have of World War II. And my goal and desire with these projects has been to mine that incredible rich trove of resources of oral histories and magazine articles and newspaper articles and documentaries and congressional testimony and in this case actually even Nobel Prize lectures and the 1,000-page transcript of J. Robert Oppenheimer's security clearance hearing with the Atomic Energy Commission, the narrative backbone of that movie Oppenheimer that came out 2 years ago. And to try to tell the story of these enormous events, D-Day in last year in the Manhattan Project and the unleashing of the atomic bomb this year, through the eyes of the people who lived them. I think that there's a particular power that comes in oral history, in that first person memory, that helps to make, to put readers back in the footsteps and minds of the people who were experiencing these events at a time when they didn't know the outcome. That to me, what is so poignant about understanding what it was like to live through these events is, what it was like to participate in D-Day before you knew it was going to be a historic triumph, before you knew who was going to win World War II, whether on to work on the Manhattan Project at a time when you didn't know whether Adolf Hitler was going to get the bomb first. And I think you see that in this, in these books, in the way that only oral history can provide, because narrative history, I love narrative history, I read narrative history, I write narrative history, but I think that there's often a sense that in narrative history that events are neater, cleaner, simpler, and more preordained than they felt to anyone who was living through them at the time. And to go back and to recreate the human experience of living through and working on these world-changing events gives a different perspective about what it was like to navigate the uncertainty of those moments. One of the things that really comes through in this project, for instance, is how, while we so immediately today associate the dropping of the atomic bomb with the war in the Pacific and the war with Japan, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the story of the Manhattan Project really is in many ways rooted in the war in Europe, and it is the wave of mostly Jewish refugee scientists fleeing the enveloping cloak of Hitler's fascism, coming to the United States in 39, 40, and 41, bringing with them the news and the possibility of the discovery of nuclear fission, and then trying to knock on every government and military door that they can in order to spur the US government to action. And you see so clearly in those opening stages of the war, particularly before the United States even formally enters World War II, that the US government and the US military just didn't view science and technology and research as a core source of national strength, and that they did not see the promise that these scientists were pushing them towards. There's a sort of amazing meeting early in the book with Edward Teller and Eugene Wigner and U.S. military leaders, where one of the colonels in charge of technology research says dismissively that he has a $10,000 reward for anyone who can build a death ray that will kill a goat tied to a post at the Aberdeen Proving Grounds in Maryland. And it's his way of saying that these scientists are wasting his time, that there is more likelihood in his mind that we will develop a death ray than ever see a working atomic bomb in their lifetime. And it is only through an enormous amount of effort by Teller and Wigner, as well as scientists up to and including Albert Einstein himself, who writes a letter to Franklin Roosevelt in the summer of 1940 about the possibility of that atomic bomb and what it could mean for Adolf Hitler, that helps finally spur the US government to action. And it is only on December 6th, Saturday, December 6th, 1941, that the US government launches the effort that we now know as the Manhattan Project. And the man atop the project at the start there is Arthur Holly Compton, who is someone who is largely forgotten in most of the Manhattan Project popular histories that you see, but that who really leads and organizes the first year of the Manhattan Project, gets the labs up and running, particularly at the University of Chicago, where he's based, that becomes the home of that first attempt to build a nuclear chain reactor in the fall of 1942, where you see the work of these University of Chicago physicists come together across the fall of 42 in an old squash court underneath the football stadium at the University of Chicago. And present and pregnant in all of their work and their race that fall is the idea that they are falling behind Hitler's similar effort. These scientists, many of them have worked with and know Werner Heisenberg and the other German scientists left behind Hitler's Third Reich, who they believe must be hard at work on a nuclear bomb as well. One of the quotes I have in the book is a physicist talking about, they have two shifts through that fall of 42 coming together with a day shift and a night shift to build this nuclear chain reactor. And that one of the day shift scientists tells the story of a night shift scientist showing up early at the site to work and saying to them, I just have a sense that somewhere in Europe, Hitler is at work on this. And if Hitler's at work on it, I want us to be on, I want to be at work as well. And in December 2nd, 1942, when they build that first successful nuclear chain reaction led by Enrico Fermi, there is a major sense that if they can do it, if the US can do this, then surely Hitler has already done it before. And it's really not until the winter and spring of 1945 that the US begins to realize that both they will beat Hitler to the bomb, but that also that Hitler was never actually particularly close to building a bomb. Ironically, in many ways, it was Hitler's anti-Semitism that keeps them from being interested in pursuing the flights of fancy of scientists like Heisenberg that talk about the possibility of building a bomb. The story of the Manhattan Project, I think, in many ways is oversimplified in most popular culture to the story of J. Robert Oppenheimer and his band of merry physicists at the on that remote mesa in New Mexico. That too often in World War II, I think we talk about the places where the war is fought: Bastogne, Omaha Beach, El Alamein, Leyte Gulf, Midway, Guadalcanal, Okinawa. But where World War II is really won is in the factories and laboratories in the United States, where we bring together the incredible industrial might necessary to defeat the Axis powers. The war is won in the Willow Run bomber factories run by Ford Motor Company in Michigan. It's won in the synthetic rubber plants in Ohio. It's won in the landing craft factories and shipyards of Higgins Industry in New Orleans. And most notably in the laboratories at Bletchley Park, where the Enigma code is broken, in the MIT Rad Lab, where we develop the radar and the proximity fuse, and in the labs and factories of the Manhattan Project, where you see the US build these enormous secret cities in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and Hanford, Washington, efforts that really dwarf the imagination. These are remote mountain valleys in Tennessee, a desert in eastern Washington, or fruit orchards in eastern Washington, where we end up building facilities that are like 50 miles wide by 50 miles long, cities that we carve out of nothing to house and employ 100,000 people apiece. Hanford, Washington, of course, specializes in the manufacture and refinement of plutonium. Oak Ridge, the refinement and manufacture of uranium, and that over incredible facilities. Oak Ridge, home to the largest roofed building in the world as one of its main uranium processing facilities. In Hanford, Washington, they build a series of buildings known as the Queen Marys because they resemble at the size and scale of cruise ships turned upside down and built in the desert to refine plutonium. In Oak Ridge, Tennessee, on the day that the Manhattan Project is announced to the world, August 6th, 1945, the bus system in Oak Ridge is actually one of the 10 largest public transit systems in the United States, and it serves a city that no one knows exists and that doesn't appear on any map. And for most of the workers at both of these facilities, they don't actually have any idea what they are doing to contribute to the war effort. That at Oak Ridge, among those 100,000 people who live there at the war's the peak of the Manhattan Project, it's one of the leaders estimates that there are actually only 50 on site who actually understand what the facility does, what it's working towards, and how they are all contributing to the war effort. Much of the staff of Oak Ridge ends up being these young high school graduate, mostly women from remote Tennessee. Tennessee Eastman is the big industrial firm that the US government brings in to staff and run and operate the facility at Oak Ridge. The US government, of course, has no idea how to staff and run a factory of 100,000 people and community of 100,000 people. And so in 43, 44, Tennessee Eastman is trying to figure out who it can hire at the scale of thousands and tens of thousands of workers. And this is, of course, in the middle of the war when the men are mostly already engaged in fighting. And so the workforce that they identify are these young, mostly high school educated girls from local surrounding communities who are brought in to run the calutrons, the machines that refine and process the uranium. There's a team of Berkeley nuclear physicist PhDs who are overseeing the project. They say, there's no way that we can teach these high school girls how to refine uranium. And so Tennessee Eastman sets up this head-to-head contest between the Tennessee girls and the Berkeley PhDs. And it, of course, turns out that the girls actually outperform the Berkeley PhDs. And these calutron girls go on to work for months, round the clock running these 2,000 calutrons. And most of them only would learn the word uranium on August 6th, 1945. Most of them spend the entire war working, running these machines, never actually knowing and understanding what the thing is that's coming out the other side of their machine. From Hanford and Oak Ridge, the story goes to Los Alamos, where the bombs are developed and assembled, tested at Trinity, in Alamogordo, New Mexico on July 16th, 1945, that first ever atomic explosion. And then the story shifts to the 509th Bomb Composite Group, which is the unit specially brought together and designed to learn how to deploy and drop the world's first atomic weapons. It is led, of course, by Colonel Paul W. Tibbets, who is just 29 years old when he is given command of the 509th. Paul Tibbets, of course, goes on to become the pilot of the Enola Gay, the plane that drops the bomb on Hiroshima. But he is not just sort of some random pilot plucked for this duty. He is one of the most experienced, one of the best bomber pilots in the entire U.S. Army Air Force in World War II, has an enormously successful career in Europe, and then is brought back to the United States to help run the training program that will start the B-29, the four-engine Boeing Super Fortress that will be the main bomber for attacking the Japanese home islands. And that this is this project, when he takes it over in 1944, is wildly off track. It's a new plane. There are all sorts of gremlins, and the engines have a reputation for being finicky, and they are starting to see the men involved in the training program refusing to fly the plane, saying it's too hard to fly. Paul Tibbets's brainstorm is that he goes down south and finds two WASPs, the women air service pilots who help fly planes domestically during World War II, and spends 3 days training the two of them to fly the B-29. Then he takes them and he flies around the country to all of the B-29 bases. And it turns out that when this plane taxis up in each B-29 base, lands, taxis, and then two women pilots get out of the cockpit, there turns out on base no longer to be any men who say that the B-29 is too hard for them to fly. So what you end up at the end of that, Tibbets is pulled off of the B-29 to go off and create this standalone, basically private air force that will be responsible for dropping the bomb, and is given the highest possible wartime priority to build this unit, which includes not just the 15 B-29s, but also support aircraft, logistical aircraft, special mechanics units, special munitions units, special security units, and a team from Los Alamos that's known as Project Alberta. And this 509th Composite Group spends about 9 months learning how to drop the bomb, learning how to fly with the bomb, and learning particularly how to do the extreme maneuver necessary to escape the bomb's blast. That Paul Tibbets is told that it's going to take them about, that from when they drop the bomb to the bomb's explosion, they have about 42 seconds to get 8 miles away from the bomb's blast if they want to survive. And he figures out that the only way to do that is to actually take the B-29 and put it into almost an entire U-turn, a 155 to 160 degree turn immediately after the dropping the bomb that will just barely get them to 8 slant miles away at 30,000 feet by the time that the bomb explodes 42 seconds later. All of that said, most of the crew only learn the word atomic bomb, only learn what this weapon is that they are being asked to deploy when the Enola Gay mission is on its way to Hiroshima on August 6th, 1945. That's sort of all they know up until then, is that there is a very large bomb that they are working on delivering. I might actually sort of pause there and start taking some questions. There are a couple more things that I want to cover, but I would imagine I'll have the chance to cover them as people have questions. So if you have questions, you can start putting them into the Q&A, or go ahead and raise your hand, and I think Greg will call on you in turn.
Yeah, Mike, not surprisingly, your hand's up. So why don't you go along and you know the drill, unmute your line and
Yes, ma'am. Um, well, first of all, one thing I'm sure you found out is that when you're compiling oral histories, you can't judge whether or not an event actually happened. From one person's oral history, you have to use what one term we used to use when I was studying journalism was triangulated fire. You had to have, 2 or 3 confirmations of that. And the fact that, to be quite honest, people's memories don't necessarily get better as they get older.
Yes.
So it may have been 10 years ago that we had, well, certainly that it was slowing down the veterans' memories. But the question, well, first of all, one small question is, wouldn't, because I always wondered about this, Tibbets knew what he was carrying and what it could do and what had to be done. But wouldn't Lewis, his co-pilot, for instance, have to know something about it? Wouldn't the bombardier, the navigator would have to know, especially if he had to do this immense U-turn, which would enable them to get home, basically, rather than doing a flyover and going further or far from the field. So wouldn't they have had to know certain amounts of information, maybe not the whole amount of information, but certain amounts of information? And I'll save my next question for later.
Sure, and yes, you're absolutely right. That when I say sort of most of the crew learned the phrase atomic bomb, certainly not all of them. That the pilots for the most part understood what they were engaged in and what they were training towards. You also sort of talked about there the way that sort of I create these, and so I think I should talk about that for a minute, which is you're absolutely right that sort of the challenge of oral history is people's memories are fallible, particularly traumatic memories are fallible. They're particularly fallible as well with the passing of age. So one of the things I try really hard to do in all of the oral history that I do is find the accounts as close to the events as possible. So this book was entirely archival research. I did not actually draw upon a single living person interview for it because my goal was to work with sort of the closest primary sources I could find. For both the D-Day book and this one, my first drafts of the book end up being about 1.4 million words. That's about 4,000 pages, and contain 2,000 or 3,000 different voices at that point. And I live in Vermont, and as a Vermonter, I talk about the process of doing oral history as like boiling maple syrup, that you sort of start with this huge vat of sap, and then you just sit there and boil and boil and boil until you're left with the very tiny fraction that ends up as syrup at the end. And so for both the D-Day book and this one, most of the book writing process is actually subtractive, not additive. And I end up throwing out between 90 and 95% of the all of the research that I've gathered in order to get down to sort of just the best possible nuggets and most sort of interwoven puzzle pieces that I can. And that, I think part of the challenge of, or part of the difference of doing these projects is, I'm all three of these books, 9/11, D-Day, and the Manhattan Project, there are terrific narrative histories that people have already written about them. If you want to know the narrative story of the Manhattan Project, Richard Rhodes's The Making of the Atomic Bomb, or Kai Bird and Marty Sherwin's American Prometheus biography of J. Robert Oppenheimer, and are two of the great history books written in the last 50 years. But what those books generally don't do is give you the perspectives of the ordinary people who are caught up in these epochal moments of history. And that's really the thing that I try to do, as Greg said in the introduction. This is a book that is not just about the names that Leslie Groves, Oppenheimer, Truman, Stimson, Tibbets. It's also the story of, the guy who makes the box lunches at Hanford, and the Calutron girls in Oak Ridge, and the person who actually loads the atomic bomb on the Enola Gay in sorry for the phone ringing here. The story of these 500 voices that all come together to try to tell a story that is more comprehensive and more complete than any one of them is able to tell on their own. So this book pulls together, I forget what the exact number is, but it's something like 105 different memoirs that various people have written about the bomb, to provide something that is much more of a mosaic view of these events.
Well, just to follow up on that, because one thing I found when interviewing the Canadian veterans of D-Day, for what I was writing about, was that when you, sometimes it would be the smallest, seem to be unimportant details that they might remember, small details. In my case, such as the rather embarrassing question, what the enemy soldiers, the German soldiers, were wearing, or what the weather was like at that moment. Sometimes those small details could lead to a revelation that had not yet been known. Yes. About the history of that moment. Did you find that as well? Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that D-Day is its own fascinating example of this, as I'm sure you sort of came to understand as well. We think of D-Day as this sort of biggest military operation in human history. There are 1 million Allied troops on the move on June 6, 1944, across the UK and the English Channel. But for most of them, their D-Day is incredibly small. It is this one stretch of beach. If you are one of the paratroopers dropped into the Norman hedgerows, your entire D-Day might be a single hedgerow. For some of the Navy or Coast Guard personnel, their entire D-Day was just one landing craft or one ship, and that they, most of them have no sense of how the overall day is unfolding. Some of my favorite, sort of most poignant oral histories that I found in my D-Day research were, from paratroopers, who were sort of isolated in their drops, and end up spending the whole day alone, and sort of, spend this huge historic day of titanic epic proportions, never actually knowing whether the landings successfully happened at all, or are they the only paratrooper, the only Allied soldier on this side of the English Channel. And I think that that's, to me, one of the really amazing parts of telling these stories through oral history, is the way that it lets you inhabit these individual experiences at a very human scale. We as humans are really bad at thinking about how we fit into the grand scope of history. There's a story that I tell actually out of my 9/11 book, which brings together the stories in that case of about 480 Americans morning to night, coast to coast, who lived through 9/11. One of the oral histories that I use, in most of the book, there are very few characters in any of the books that you follow through from the start of the book to the end. Most people sort of come and go either just in one particular chapter, or even sometimes just in a single quote, as their sort of story intersects the bigger story of that day. And one of the few people that you follow through the whole book of 9/11, a book called The Only Plane in the Sky, where is this guy named Richard Eichen, who is one of just 5 survivors from the 90th floor of the World Trade Center, the highest floor where there are any survivors at all. And he makes his way all the way down. He's injured in the initial crash. He makes his way all the way down. It takes him so long that he is then sort of caught in the debris field of the collapse, makes his way to a hospital where he's treated in Lower Manhattan. He gets scared about the idea of follow-on attacks, and is in his hospital gown, breaks himself out of the hospital and walks across the Brooklyn Bridge. And there's actually this photo of him in the book that a news photographer caught that day, that only sort of people pieced together that it was Richard later, where he's in his hospital gown walking across the Brooklyn Bridge carrying a plastic bag with a Snapple, which is the only thing that he sort of has to eat and drink across 9/11, and then makes it to Brooklyn and hitchhikes home on the back of a pickup truck. And I used in oral history that Richard Eichen had given the 9/11 Memorial and Museum, who did this sort of incredible oral history project around 9/11 survivors, and then had the chance to actually meet Richard at the 9/11 Museum when I was on my book tour in 2019. And he comes up to me and he goes, I can't believe you used my story. And I was like, Richard, like, with all due respect, like, I read 2,000 of these oral histories to assemble this book. And like, yours is one of the like 5 most incredible experiences that any American has on 9/11. And he just sort of had never made that mental leap from sort of this just being his story to understanding sort of how he fit into the grand scope of the human experience that day.
Good example. Thank you.
Great. We have a number of questions. Just going to the sort of logistics front. How, given the Manhattan Project was such as much engineering and logistical triumph as a scientific, what oral histories did you review that best captured of the project, as well as the secrecy required?
Yeah, so one of the sort of great troves, and if anyone listening is a real Manhattan Project nerd, you can dive into this yourself. The Oak Ridge Public Library has actually done this amazing oral history project with workers from Oak Ridge, And they're all on video, they're all audio transcripts, and they're all available on the Oak Ridge Public Library website. And I was able to use dozens of those to sort of really help capture that like ordinary person perspective. The Atomic Heritage Foundation has done a great job collecting the interviews of folks like Richard Rhodes and Stefan Graff, who sort of turned over their interviews after their own books were published, and those are available online for perusal now. And then, as I said, there are just an enormous number of memoirs. The 509th Bomb Composite Group actually has done some really awesome oral history, written sort of personal history reunion around some of their reunions, where they've sort of brought people together and collected memories and published them, that again give you the perspective of like, the 1,200 people in the 509th who are not any of the 10 names from history that those were enormously useful for painting the picture of what like day-to-day life in Tinian is like through the spring and summer of 1945.
Great. Another question concerns your interviewing or reviewing the archives of spouses and families. Did you come across any material or viewpoints that challenge the traditional narrative, particularly around Oppenheimer and the scientists?
Yeah, so there's sort of a couple buckets there. One is, Oak Ridge is the only of the Manhattan Project facilities that is set in the Jim Crow South. And it is there is a sort of darker underside to that story of the segregated facilities and the segregated workforce. And I include some of those quotes in the book, where you have Black workers lamenting how no matter how highly skilled they were, if you were at Oak Ridge, you were relegated to basically cleaning and making meals. The spouses' stories, are actually a big portion of both the Hanford, Oak Ridge, and Los Alamos stories that I end up telling. There's a real sense of sort of joie de vivre among the spouses and the workforce at Los Alamos. I think sort of that was considered a very romantic and sort of fun assignment, and much less so for the spouses and families in Oak Ridge and Hanford. One of the things I tried to do in the book was capture as well some of the Latino voices at Los Alamos, some of the Native American voices in roles, and the centrality of some of those Native experiences in and around Los Alamos as well.
Great. Next question about, were there any differences in the demographics and how the impact of the bomb from a moral perspective? Were some more in favor or against based on their perspective, or in helping bring about the Manhattan Project?
Yeah, so one of the things that you see is I spent a lot of time in the book talking about what I end up calling really the permission structure that guides the dropping of the bomb at the end of the war. And I think it's something that we really misunderstand, because we think about how that decision would be made today. We sort of, I think, imagine there being this one specific moment where, West Wing style, Harry Truman is sitting in the Situation Room and all the generals and admirals are around him and each of them goes, go, no go. And then Harry Truman says, drop the bomb. And there's some guy who picks up the red phone and, Paul Tibbets is standing on the runway in Tinian, awaiting the order. And that's not really how this happens at all. And it's this very bureaucratic process, where Henry Stimson and the Air Force leadership and the Manhattan Project leadership basically come up with a plan to drop the bomb, present it to Harry Truman, who, by the way, is only learning about the existence of the Manhattan Project and the existence of an atomic bomb after he becomes president. Even as vice president, he was never read into this project. And Harry Truman sort of just doesn't opt out of the dropping of the bomb. And then by the time these orders are transmitted to Tinian in July, the orders are sort of as vague as, the bombs will be delivered to you beginning in late July, early August, and you will drop the bombs as soon after August 1st as you can, and continue to drop the bombs as soon as they are ready. And in fact, actually, really the only decision Harry Truman makes around the dropping of the bomb is to not drop a third bomb, that after the bombing of Nagasaki, that they sort of pause the future bomb preparation to give time for sort of the surrender conversations to take place back and forth through proxies between the US and Japan. And that what you really see, I think, what you really have to sort of wrap your mind around is the scale and scope of World War II is so enormous. The death toll by the summer of 1945 is 60 million people, based on the National World War II Museum number. Other numbers are 75, 80 million, which means sort of the rounding error on the dead of World War II is the entire population of the state of New York. And that, in that 60 million estimate, it's 15 million combatants, 45 million civilians, and that we by 1945 humans have killed each other in sort of every creative possible way. We sort of lose sight of the fact that the Japanese had run a whole biological weapons effort against the Chinese that involves, the bubonic plague and cholera and typhoid fever that kills, hundreds of thousands of Chinese. That overall, the number of Chinese dead is still so vaguely understood that we round it off to the closest 5 million, because we just really don't understand what took place on mainland China in World War II. And that the atomic bomb is not, of course, the first bombing mission against Japan. Through that whole spring and summer, we are engaged in the firebombing campaign against Japanese cities with Curtis LeMay and his B-29s. The deadliest day of World War II, the deadliest day of human conflict in history, is not the dropping of the atomic bomb. It's the Operation Meeting House firebombing of Tokyo in March 1945, where we kill 100,000 Japanese in a single night. And then from there, bomb 66 more Japanese cities and towns. This is probably like the one audience that I'm speaking to this fall that sort of knows this history, better than I do. But that, the firebombing is so extensive, so deadly, and so destructive that U.S. war planners actually have to save Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Kokura, and a couple of other Japanese cities for the atomic bomb, to take them off the list for potential firebombing, because if we firebomb those cities first, there's not going to be enough of them left in order to actually drop an atomic bomb on the cities. And that, I think we view the dropping of the atomic bomb as sort of different and distinct with our post-war moral clarity, in a way that most of the people who are involved in this decision-making over the spring and summer of 45 just didn't view it as something entirely different. They knew it was a different weapon, they knew it was a different strength, but that sort of, these were all cities that we were going to bomb and destroy one way or another. So you see, there are different pockets of public opinion in World War II in the Manhattan Project. There are the physicists who are like, I got into this project to drop to beat Adolf Hitler and drop an atomic bomb on Berlin. And they're disappointed that they're too late. They wanted the bomb to be ready in 44 and to drop a bomb then. And then there's a chunk of the scientists who, World War II consumes and involves whole families in a way that I think we often forget. And so, there's a chunk of them, I quote Leona Woods, one of the Manhattan Project scientists, to this effect in the book, where she talks about how her brother is alive today because she invented the atomic bomb, that her brother was a Marine flamethrower in Okinawa and was due into the second wave of the Japanese invasion. And, she knows in her heart of hearts that inventing the atomic bomb and dropping the atomic bomb saved her brother.
Very interesting, Garrett. I just want to read this comment from Charles. I know you responded, quote, I am 83 years old. My father worked at Oak Ridge and Hanford and went to University of Chicago. I have some pictures and letters. He's reaching out to your publisher, and he notes the only plane in the sky is the best history book he's ever read. That's pretty high praise. There are a few questions on this sort of moral calculus of dropping the bomb versus continuing the war, and ultimately how many lives the bomb would quote unquote save. And just referenced sort of a tangent to that in the. Can you talk a little bit more about that? How they rationalize the bomb would ultimately save lives?
Yeah. So some of this is, one of the things we also, I think, sort of forget is the U.S. in the spring, and we're not just firebombing the cities from the sky. We are running something that is actually called Operation Starvation, which is a remarkably on-the-nose name for the naval blockade and mining efforts that are targeting the Japanese home islands. We are destroying their industrial capability. There's no oil tanker that makes it to Japan after, I think it's March 1945, for a country that is primarily a net importer of oil. The Japanese rice crop is collapsing in the summer of 45 due to environmental reasons. The average Japanese adult in the summer of 1945 is surviving on about 1,400 calories a day, which is, less than half what a normal adult meal should be. And this is setting the country up for a famine in the summer and fall of 45 that is going to kill 200,000 Japanese civilians a month, above and beyond whatever the human casualties are from firebombing, from the military engagements, and any possible invasion. Of course, Chester Nimitz believes that we sort of don't need to drop the bomb at all, and that we can basically just starve Japan without an invasion at all. But that when you sort of get into the calculus of all of this, at the time, again, I think we draw this sort of much clearer line between like, should they have dropped the bomb or not, than anyone at the time thought. And that the reality that most of the war planners were thinking about in the summer of 45 was they were going to drop the bomb. They were going to keep firebombing. They were going to keep starving the Japanese people. The Soviets were still going to invade Manchuria and China. And then we were still probably going to have to invade. That this was sort of a much more of a all of the above plan than it was this sort of binary of like, do we drop the bomb to end the war or not?
Yeah, it seems very complicated answer. Mike, I know you said you had a follow-up. I see your hand raised again. Maybe if you want to ask your follow-up.
Yeah, actually, the second question was because you talked about, you mentioned the war was really won in the industries in the United States, or to a lesser degree in Canada and Britain. But the question is, I mean, it's really all interrelated. The reason that our industry was able to function so well is that we weren't able to be bombed
Yes.
in North America, whereas the German industry and to a large degree later the Japanese industry was able to be bombed, and whatever, at the very least, it mitigated and delayed any production there. Also, you could say in the Pacific, had we not had the military not taken the Marianas, then of course we wouldn't have had a base, since China wasn't really lucrative. We wouldn't have had a base to launch the Enola Gay, the nuclear bomb. So could you address the interrelatedness? It's really, it's not one thing or one area that won the war, but how these things were interrelated and interrelated as far as the decision-making process.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you at all. Like it is the industrial output of the United States that allows the combat levels and support that we are able to deliver. There's a statistic in the book that I'm not going to get exactly right, but by the summer of 45, for every 2 pounds of supplies that Japan is able to deliver to its soldiers in the field in the Pacific, the U.S. is supplying 4 tons of supplies to every soldier in the Pacific. I mean, and you're right that obviously that sort of has to do with the distance and security that we have from the either of the foes, the 2 big oceans that protect us, as well as the industrial might and the national national resources that we're able to bring to bear on the war. One of the things I sort of talk about in this, and maybe this is actually a good place to end it since we're at 2:00 here, is I think we think of the Manhattan Project, the legacy of the Manhattan Project, as the nuclear bomb. And in many ways, I think the most important legacy of the Manhattan Project is how it shows the US government a different way to think about science, technology, and research as a core national strength. And that the relationship that the projects like the Manhattan Project and the Rad Lab at MIT with the radar and the proximity fuse bring together is this model of how higher education and government-supported science research and technology development can be, and by the way, openness to immigrants from overseas coming here to work and invent stuff, is what allows the US to really take off after the war. And of course, one of the things that also is, that allows us to take off after the war is like Japan's industry is devastated, Europe's industry is devastated, and sort of our factories are untouched. But that really it's that model of how to think about science and technology and the support of government research that leads to the creation of things like the National Science Foundation and ultimately DARPA. The transformation of the NIH into a major grant giving organization after the war, that sort of lets the U.S. take off as this incredible font of post-war innovation and invention. So,
Well,
Greg, thank you for hosting. Thank you all for attending and giving up of some of your Saturday afternoon to watch and talk. It's been wonderful.
Yeah, thank you, Garrett. Great lecture. Again, the book, The Devil Reached Toward the Sky, An Oral History of the Making and Unleashing of the Atomic Bomb by Garrett Graff. Please join us next Saturday, October 4th at 1 p.m. when Peter Hayes will discuss his book, Profit and Persecution, German Big Business in the Third Reich, which unites business history and the history of the Holocaust to consider both the economic and personal motivations that rendered German corporate leaders complicit in the action of the Nazi Party. Hopefully you can join us. Until then, enjoy the rest of your afternoon and have a great week. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.